Politicians love it when they're told the same thing once. They get a bit annoyed if they're told the same thing by a bunch of people who couldn't coordinate themselves to campaign on an issue together.
It's a bit like an episode of Dragon's Den. They're going to meet quite a few people throughout that day, trying to grab their attention, asking them to do things. And you've got to make sure that, that you're the person that they pick. And so it is, you've got to be likable.
First question is, do the politicians even know it's happening?
Welcome to the CommsCast with Jersey Road. This is the latest episode. My name is Gareth Russell. Today we're going to be talking about advocacy and political advocacy particularly. And I'm delighted that we have a couple of political advocacy legends in the room, both digitally and physically. Gareth Wallace and Louise Davies. Gareth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
And Louise, thank you for joining us all the way from where are you right now?
I'm in Sheffield at the moment, so yeah.
Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you being here with us. Advocacy, in my opinion, feels like one of those words that different people have different definitions of, and different organizations may mean different things by when they say the word. So do you want to just talk a little bit about what is advocacy, Gareth, first?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, I think, as you say, an advocate is a word with multiple meanings. I think for me, it's rooted in speaking and speaking out. And my wife's in the law. You can have a legal advocate. We're obviously communicating a lot with people in the media. But I suppose when it comes to policy, what we're thinking about is who gets to speak in the corridors of power, and what words do they use, and who gets access, who gets the microphone.
And Louise, talk to us a little bit about your background in this space and what's kind of got you into it.
Okay, so my background, I'm used to doing a lot of speaking out, but I was, many years ago, I was a church pastor, and then I received prophecies to go into politics. And so I've been doing that for the last 11 years. I've run for election, lost election. I've worked for an MP, so I've been on the receiving end of advocacy. For 5 years, I was a director of Christians on the Left, which is an affiliate of the Labour Party. And for the last 2 years, I have been the director of advocacy and policy at CARE. And so my job, I am in and out of Parliament every single day. And for me, advocacy is speaking up on behalf of others. And I think my key verse is probably Proverbs 31, where it says, speak out on behalf of the voiceless. And so, people like myself and Gareth, we're in that privileged position where we do have the ear of some of the change makers in this nation. And our job is to advocate for those who don't have a voice, who don't have access to those people.
And you guys have known each other a long time, right?
We have, yeah. We're just reminiscing. We've been on tour with Christians in Politics. We've been speaking together at Christian festivals in the summer. This is a much more beautiful studio than the one you're able to provide for us. But yes, there's a great partnership across the political parties, and it's interesting as well. I think politics and advocacy are seasonal, and we've just had a new election. We've had sadly, some MPs have left, and some new amazing ones have been elected. And part of the job of advocacy is relationship building and getting to know those new people and not losing the people who've gone. You never know in which incarnation people will come back in and be of help and of influence in the future.
Talk a little bit about your journey then, in terms of how you got into this. What was the kind of first seeds of your passion for this area, and how your journey's evolved since then?
I think as a teenager, I remember adults talking, usually in reference to the news. This has not changed, by the way, plot spoiler. And people would complain, they'd listen to the news and they'd complain about how society was run, about how the world was run, about how the politicians of the day were making decisions. And just a seed was sown in my precocious little mind. Who's in charge? Are they not the same age as these adults I know? What happens when you grow up? And what do you want to be when you grow up? What happens if you get to meet those people or become those people? And that set me on a journey of studying politics at university and working for a couple of Christian charities in their advocacy teams, and finding out that it is people who, in the words of Andy Flanagan, the people who show up are often the people who get given the microphone and get to make the decisions. And if we open that door, knock on the door, rattle a few cages, ask the right questions, we too can be inside asking the right questions for the people who maybe wouldn't normally get to speak.
Mm. And Louise, from your perspective, in your career, have you seen the nature of advocacy change during that time, and successful advocacy, is that changed, or is it still is the process and the way of doing it is the same as it's always been?
I think previously, you would get a meeting with your MP and then you'd state your case, but I think recently I'm seeing a lot more changes happening through using social media. And I think that what's really interesting are the social media influencers who are coming through. I was at a drinks reception just yesterday, and it was for people who are advocating for beginning of life issues. And I said to the organisers, have you got any politicians in this room? It's really hard to find out who the politicians are at the moment because there's so many new ones. And they said, no, all of these people in this room are social media influencers.
Oh.
And it really struck me that that's the next wave of advocacy coming through. That, yeah, there'll always be those face-to-face meetings, but it's what these influencers are saying and the traction that it's getting online. And so that's how I feel that advocacy is changing, particularly in the last few years.
And just to kind of ground this a little bit, because I think again, advocacy can be quite a broad term.
Mm.
Can you just give some concrete examples, maybe from your experience or from other stuff you've seen happen, of successful advocacy campaigns that have genuinely brought about change?
So I think, building on what Louise has said, I'm thinking about social media. Who's speaking is really important. When I was at World Vision, it was a children's charity. It was very passionate about elevating children's voices. So whenever we were trying to speak, it's no use me speaking as a middle-aged man about girls' education in Kenya. Much better getting one of our Kenyan young people to speak for themselves and to actually be in the meeting. The advantage of social media and lockdown was we were able to host events online. So I think who holds the microphone has become increasingly important. I'm reminded of, we're obviously looking at the Grenfell report at the minute. I used to live in a council high-rise block. I was involved in my free time in very local advocacy, in being a member of the Tenants Association, and actually we had our block reclad partly because of fire safety, and just representing people who would never consider themselves advocates. I'd really want to encourage people to think about the issues of injustice around them, and not to kind of mythologize, or I think people can excuse themselves thinking I'm not qualified to do that, or that's a national issue, and then it flows into things like, well, all politicians are the same. And I think we need to unpack some of those things. Often a lot of the politicians, they started out on the streets, they started out as councillors, they started out doing what I call the poo and pavement stuff, of just fixing local things, and then we see that those things become very big national issues that really affect people's lives. So you want to get the passion of the people who are actually affected. So yeah, I think some of the stuff around the campaigning that's happened around Grenfell would be a really good example, where because of social media, disrepair in social housing is now something that local councils, they get it in their Twitter feeds. They cannot ignore it in the same way that they have in the past, and that feeds back to the MPs and the councillors. And I've had experience of that really making a difference.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Louise, what about you, from your perspective? Just some practical examples of what's really worked.
Well, for my organisation, CARE, we had a success last year with the Online Safety Act. And online safety has been something that we've been passionate about for a number of years. And we'd had some previous experience with the Digital Economy Act in 2017. So we'd built up our expertise. And through forming a small coalition with Barnardo's and Cease, and a number of politicians, we were able to bring age verification through, which will be implemented next year. So that means that up until now, children have been having free rein about accessing pornography online. And because of that advocacy campaign, that we've been able to bring in that age verification. For us, what worked, it was cross-party, it was bringing in, the different organizations. So obviously Bernardo's big children's charity, and it's a well-known name. CEASE, they advocate on behalf of victims of prostitution and porn, and then we brought in our legal expertise, and so that was a great team to bring that forward. And I think what really worked for us was that coalition of working with other people, because I think just as our own organisation, we didn't have enough resource in expertise, and as Gareth said, who's got the microphone, and so it was that coalition that brought that about. So we find working with other organisations is a definite win for us.
Can I just really agree with that? Whenever I was at the Salvation Army, we spent about 10 years lobbying on gambling with a hugely well-resourced industry, and we worked with other faith groups, particularly church denominations. And because we were working in coalition, we then had the resource, and also we felt we could speak with the numbers because we were representing a much greater number of people in the background. And we ended up working with bishops in the House of Lords. We won a vote by 3 votes that ended super casinos in this country, and then that turned into being the official representatives on the Gambling Commission's community liaison group. So people who, none of us considered ourselves experts, but because we were considered to represent a social policy, represent society more broadly, we were brought in as a listening ear over many years, and that helped influence the growing problem around online betting. So again, if you feel you're lonely, either as an individual or as a smaller organization, absolutely work in coalition. Politicians love it when they're told the same thing once. They get a bit annoyed if they're told the same thing by a bunch of people who couldn't coordinate themselves to campaign on an issue together.
Yeah, okay. So you're keeping the relationship strong if you're doing it in coordination.
Yeah.
If so, say I'm an organization, I don't have political connections. I do have things to say about particular issues that I see as wrong in society. What questions do I need to be asking? And I'll put this to both of you, but what questions do I need to be asking as an organization to know if advocacy is the right route for me to go?
I'd have to think about that. I think for me, advocacy, particularly parliamentary advocacy, again, it's rooted in relationship. So for me, it's I'd want to know who my local MP is, but more than that, I'd want to know who in my organisation, if I'm a membership organisation, how can I reach out into Parliament in a way that rattles a mailbag that goes bing in the MP's inbox. I think there's two. I think you're asking something slightly different though about, is advocacy the answer to the problem I'm asking? I'm not sure. Maybe Louise has got.
Louise, do you want to help Gareth out there?
I don't know if I can, to be honest. I think as Christians, then the first protocol is we've got to ask God, don't we? Is this, what is the best way? Is this wise to pursue this? Is this a good idea or a God idea? And then, is advocacy the best way to achieve what you want to achieve? And you've got to ask yourself, what is it that you want to do? If you want to see a law change, then advocating in Parliament is definitely the way to go about it. It's whether you want to change the narrative about a subject, then you probably don't need to do a bit of advocacy. It's what is it that you want to change? And I think if you know exactly what you're called to do, then you can rearrange your resources accordingly. If advocacy is the best way, then there's a number of things that you need to be doing. And as Gareth said, it's got to be a relationship. You've got to start showing up. Gareth and I, we have turned up to so many events together. And it's because we want to know who's in the room and who can we secure a meeting with. We want to know which MPs are passionate about that subject. You know, how are they voting at the moment? Because we've got a new intake of MPs, we're trying to coordinate, you know, what is it that they feel about assisted suicide, because that's going to be an issue that we're going to be addressing. So we're kind of like stalking and trolling MPs at the moment, finding out how they actually stand on this subject. And so that gives us a more informed position. And then if you want a particular MP that you want to contact, then you've got to work out who do they know. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And I often find with MPs that the best way to get through the door is to be introduced by another MP. Or, you know, like when I first started at CARE, I knew a lot of Labour MPs, but I didn't necessarily know a lot of Conservative MPs. And so I asked Sir Gary Streeter, who is like a patriarch of Christians in Parliament, particularly Conservative Christians. And I went, Sir Gary, who should I meet? And he gave me a list, and I said, can I use your name? And he said yes. And so I contacted all these Christian Conservative MPs, and I said, Sir Gary recommended that I should get in contact with you. And that opened so many doors. And so I think it's not just going with advocacy. I think that you need to have a plan in place. Is it short term? Is it long term? You know, because as Gareth said, with the gambling issue, that's taken years. Online safety has taken years. And so it's got to make sure, do you have the resources to keep knocking on that door? Because one of the things that you really need as an advocate is that resilience, to be like the widow seeking justice and keep knocking on the door until the door opens. And so there's so many different things that you need to be considering, like, you know, do you have a supporter base? So that when you want to contact MPs, that you can ask them to act on your behalf. You know, what's coming up on the parliamentary agenda? Because you want to catch a wave, don't you? And so, yeah, there's so many questions. But I think if you're starting off in advocacy, then perhaps you should come along someone who is more experienced. You know, come and ask me out for a coffee, or Gareth, or someone else from another advocacy organisation, and say, this is what I want to achieve. What are your top tips? And so Gareth and I have done it over the years with people wanting to become MPs. And so, you know, if you haven't got that knowledge, you need to seek it. And it's always good to find people who are further down the road who can tell you, you know, this is what worked for me, and these are the potholes that you need to avoid. So yeah, sorry, I've just thrown in loads there of different questions that we need to answer.
Can I add in another thought that's I've been mulling over, because it's hard to know without a specific example when you say, should we advocate on something? I think there's a really interesting distinction as well. My most recent role was as head of advocacy for Open Doors, and Open Doors are really well known for their World Watch List. Sometimes with something as big and as complicated as terrible human rights abuses of Christians being persecuted for their faith in countries all around the world, you could ask the question, well, what can the British government do about country X or government Y? Those are really difficult questions. But first question is, do the politicians even know it's happening? So I wonder if there's a whole part of advocacy that is simply awareness raising, that is simply drawing attention, increasing the knowledge. This is where I feel, because some of my work covered comms and media, there's a really useful grey area between what journalists do and what advocates and politicians do. Because sometimes what a really good MP can do, especially if they don't have a lever, they're not a government minister, maybe they're in charge of a committee, the thing they can do is draw attention, maybe on the international stage. But if MPs are just contacted cold about an issue, and there's no background, there's no media coverage, there's no story, there's no academic study, so it might feel lonely, it might feel a bit dry, it might feel like you're not actually asking the advocacy question yet, but maybe just telling your story and explaining to people there is a problem. Now can we work on some solutions together? That's half the battle.
That's super helpful. Are politicians or MPs always the right target for advocacy campaigns, or is there any value in targeting civil servants, for example, or other people within the kind of political framework?
Absolutely. It's a sliding scale. Again, coming back to the relationship idea, certainly on, for example, the advocacy on freedom of religion and belief and on gambling, you're going to be dealing with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. You're going to be dealing with Department of Culture, Media and Sport. You're going to need to know, and you will be meeting civil servants, often quite senior ones. Some are perhaps the stereotypical fast track ones. They'll move on after a couple of years. You need to refresh your contact book. So it's a constant process. And also the example with particularly the gambling lobbying, we built up really good relationships with the Times, the Daily Mail and the BBC. Whenever a lever wasn't working, Louise mentioned about, is it actually legislative? I think increasingly in recent years, it hasn't been fighting a bill line by line. Maybe that was the case with gambling. Often it's more about the cultural aspect, or what does society think about an issue. So maybe it's more about the APPGs, the different groups that debate.
All party parliamentary
I
groups.
should avoid the jargon. So these are like debating societies that MPs have, or interest groups that MPs have, because MPs will come into Parliament. Maybe they've been a civil servant. Maybe they've been an activist. I think we've got more former advocacy professionals now as MPs than ever before. They know how it works. They are often coming with their own causes. If you listen to some of the maiden speeches at the minute, they'll say what the issues are they're passionate about. You can analyze that. But the answer to the question is, do you need more than just MP relationships? Of course, the full gamut, local government, national government, the civil servants, and you can even go international as well.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe a similar question to you, Louise, is particularly when you're looking to influence policy, is it just the incumbent power that's in government that you should be targeting, or is there any benefit in targeting other parties too?
Okay, yeah. In 2019, I was very involved in that general election, and the fallout of that election, because I moved in Labour Party circles. Everyone was saying, "Oh, this is going to take 2 terms to get back in office." This is going to, nobody really thought at that stage that, that in 2024 there would be a Labour government. I don't think anyone thought that. If you think back to today, Boris Johnson's popularity was amazing, and if you put all your eggs in one basket and just gone with a Conservative government and Conservative MPs, you're going to have an advocacy campaign that has just fallen by the wayside by now. And so I would recommend that. You never quite know what's going to happen politically, but it's always good to have uptake from across Parliament. Really, it's good to get lots of different voices, because it makes your campaign more credible as well. Yeah. And so with the Online Safety Act, we'd got people from all political persuasions, and when we were asking people to speak in the chambers, we were very conscious that we wanted a Conservative, we wanted a Labour, we wanted to hear the voices from Northern Ireland, we wanted to hear a lot of voices. And I think that's really, really important. I think another thing to bear in mind is that there are 2 kinds of politicians in Parliament. You've got MPs and you've got Lords. Now, MPs can be, they can be voted out, but the Lords aren't. And what we found in, the last government is that there wasn't much scrutiny happening in the House of Commons. The scrutiny was actually happening in the House of Lords. And so the Lords were the best people I found in the last government to be actually bringing those speeches and laying down those amendments and trying to change laws. And so it's getting a lot of different people involved. And I think that most people, when they see politics, they think of Prime Minister's questions, PMQs on a Wednesday lunchtime, and it's pure pantomime, where it's very combative and stuff like that. But in fact, in the day-to-day of Parliament, you've got MPs working across the parties, because they're trying to bring up that support so they can bring about legislation. And then, as Gareth's mentioned with the APPGs, they're great in that you've got a lot of MPs from different parties but are passionate about that one subject. So my recommendation is to be diverse, and not only with your politicians, but also those organizations that you are working in coalition with. I wouldn't necessarily go just with Christian organizations. I think that, working with non-Christian organizations like we did with Bernardo's just brings about a credibility. And when, the assisted suicide campaign goes, when we get that going to the next level in Scotland, because that's a bill that's going through there, we'll be working with disability charities, we'll be working with the palliative care sector, just so it brings a whole different edge to it. Because I think sometimes when you're the Christian in the advocate space, then people dismiss you because they think that you're going to evangelize to them or you're going to bash them with the Bible. But by working in coalition with non-Christians as well, I just think it makes it more credible, and I think it cuts through.
Can I just really agree with that? I think Bill Clinton called it triangulation. You want to give your opponent nowhere to go. So if you have unusual allies, if you nix the counter arguments before they've even happened, that broadens your appeal, it broadens your base. There's also the constitutional reason to go with opposition parties. Opposition in the House of Commons, the leader of the opposition has an official role under our constitution. They get to obviously ask questions. Every level of minister and shadow minister, there are opportunities to challenge the government, perhaps especially if you maybe come from background where it's the party you normally align with or in government. Where's your lever gone if they're now in charge? Maybe you have to go to the opposition to ask the opposite. You have to go and find an unusual ally to challenge. This is where perhaps bringing in the media or bringing in a parliamentary select committee or an all-party group or at the House of Lords is really helpful. There's also a legal issue here, and we've just come through an election. Campaigners, charities, they need to be a little bit careful about things around the Lobbying Act and charity law. They should not be afraid, though. It's not a charter to be scared of advocacy or lobbying. It should not have a chilling effect on running robust campaigns and having an opinion. But what helps protect you is if you are doing it even-handedly across the political spectrum.
So the combination of all that you guys have just shared is a lot of what to do in order to activate a healthy or successful advocacy campaign. What are some of the things that organizations should absolutely avoid when thinking about advocacy?
Being frit of saying anything, being too cautious about what you can, or second guessing yourself too often. I think we walk before we run. I think being worried that the resources won't match. I think the most inspirational campaigns are the ones that actually grab attention. A lot of campaigns are started, a lot of ideas are floated, a lot of events happen before something catches light. And you might have to go through a lot of iterations before something, the rubber hits the road or there's a breakthrough. Maybe it's a little bit like an iceberg. For all the campaigns and things you see hitting the news, or you see a private member's bill going through Parliament, or you see the government defeated in a vote, there'll be dozens of campaigns that never saw the light of day. So I think not being afraid to try stuff and to go for it, because you never know what tactic or which ally or what campaign is going to lead to the breakthrough. And
Louise, would you add anything to that in terms of things to avoid as you're thinking about advocacy campaigns?
I think just be very watchful of your tone. That we don't come in going that God has spoken to me, this is what God says, I am an advocate of the truth. And I think that if you come over as compassionate, if you come over as as though you're listening, I think that goes a great way. It's having that convicted civility, isn't it? It's having those convictions, like Gareth said, and being willing to vocalize them. But it's also having that civility as well. You want people to like you. I often think when I'm meeting politicians, it's a bit like an episode of Dragon's Den. They're going to meet quite a few people throughout that day, trying to grab their attention, asking them to do things. And you've got to make sure that, that you're the person that they pick. And so it is, you've got to be likable, don't be afraid to speak truth, but you can do that in a very gracious way.
This is so true. Kirsty McNeil, who many of us know in the advocacy world, used to be the director of advocacy for Save the Children. She's just become an MP and is straight in the Scotland office as a minister. And she posted a really helpful answer on LinkedIn. People were, I suppose, wondering what it's like now being poacher turned gamekeeper, and she gave this kind of reply as to what it feels like now being a minister, and what are some of the tips that would be best for approaching her. And we've just got to remember, I mean, she's a really obvious example of someone who's literally been in a campaigner's shoes. The politician has thought about this. They're often the person who has wrestled with a lot of the answers that maybe have not worked. You need to go in there not explaining the problem to them again a different way. You by all means, do it. But the reason why you've been offered a meeting, or the reason why they might like a meeting and a follow-on, is because you've got some answers. You've got an idea that might work. And the other thing, which is a really tricky one, because it happens all the time, is the question that you're always asking the politician, I want more money for my issue because ... It may be the case, but I would, and it's really hard to do, but I would challenge people, don't let the minister go away with the impression that that was your primary ask. Much better to go in with, I think we could do things better, and maybe it'll save money.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe we're going to come into land in a second, but just to talk maybe through some of the risks if you're engaging in advocacy campaign, because I think that there'll be some organizations who may feel like they have something to say about a particular issue, and it might feel that they do feel that advocacy is the right route, but they might also feel that raising their profile or raising their head above the parapet, or maybe aligning with a particular party or politician could be a risk in itself, because you don't know what's going to be in the paper tomorrow morning, or you don't know if they're going to be in power in the next year. So talk through some of the risks and maybe some of the ways of mitigating those risks. And maybe Louise, I'll start with you, and then Gareth, you can add to that.
Okay, I think quite a few people are hesitant to enter politics because they think that it's quite murky. But I would really encourage people to show up. It's an exciting space to be in, and it is a powerful place to be in as well. And when people are speaking ill of politicians, I think this is my number one thing that I talk about on radio, really, of how hardworking politicians are. And it's really easy for us to say, oh, all politicians are the same and they're corrupt and stuff. And it's not true at all. It's not true at all. My experience is that the majority of MPs that I've worked with are in it for the right reason. They want to make a difference to the people who live in their constituencies. They are incredibly hardworking, and they are sacrificing a lot to serve the public good as well. And I think as Christians, we should be speaking highly of our politicians and endeavouring to work with them. I think it comes down to relationship. And the more that you know somebody, then the more that you can trust that politician as well. If you've got, like, as we've already mentioned, that broad support across the parties, then you're not just relying on the one politician. I think also it comes back to what I said right at the beginning. Is this a good idea, or is this a God idea? Because if it's a God idea, then you might experience pushback, and you might experience, some negative press. But if you're confident that that's what God's called you to do, then that's a time to push through and to endure, because most things pass very quickly anyway. But yeah, I think that just be confident of who you are in God, what God's called you to do, and build those relationships with those MPs to make sure that they do work.
I completely agree with everything Louise has said. I think if I was going to give a challenge, I kind of, count the cost before you build the tower. I would say your advocacy begins at home, first of all. So I remember with particularly large organizations I work for, like the Salvation Army and World Vision, you've got to win over people internally. You've got to brief them effectively. You've got to decide difficult questions before you go into the room. Take the Salvation Army. I think we totaled about 10 areas, from missing people to homelessness to employment to anti-human trafficking, that we could have worked on. And my boss very wisely decided that she would have the internal discussion each year and prioritize what we could actually focus in on, what we could actually resource. If you're a smaller organization, it's still the same. You'll have trustees, maybe you'll have people who are not aware of what potentially could go wrong. This isn't an advert for Jersey Road, but it could be. Make sure you've got a comms professional on the phone.
Amen.
Again, if something goes wrong and you're in the news,
Yeah.
explaining to your management, explaining to your director and your trustees, we could be front page news and it could be wonderful. We could be the hero of the story, or we could be misrepresented and briefed against and the dark arts used against us. It's not a reason not to do it. It's a reason to be aware and to be wise and to sit down and to count the cost and to think. There's loads of resources out there. Again, going in coalitions really helpful with other organizations, particularly larger ones who have more experience. Legal advice and training. Some legal firms, many charities will have a legal firm anyway on retainer. Many legal firms will run advocacy and legal training for free. Just think and consider, how can I bring my people with me, so that if challenges do arise, then they know what they might need to do and what they need to be prepared for. But don't make it have a chilling effect. There are people out there who need to hear, and there are people without a voice who want to be heard.
Well, I don't think there's any better way for us to conclude this chat than with that point. And the main point I got from that was call Jersey Road if you want to become professional. But Louise, thank you so much for joining us. Gareth, thank you for coming in and joining us as well. I hope that if you've been watching this or listening to this, that you have found it helpful. For me, I know that it's been very practical and very helpful in understanding the process, and I hope that is for your organization too. If you want to find out more about Jersey Road, then you can do by searching for Jersey Road online. But otherwise, we hope you have a good day, and we'll see you next time. Yeah.